Hi. So this video is all about therapy. So we're going to be talking a little bit about what therapy actually is, some of the different types of therapy that are available, because there are so many, and it can potentially feel quite overwhelming to know, what's going to work for you, what's even being offered. We're going to talk about when it might be a good idea to access therapy, and how to access therapy as well, because it can be a bit of a minefield. So we're going to talk about how to access funded therapy through NHS services or even charitable services, but we're also going to talk about private therapy as well. So we want to make sure that every option that is available to you, you're able to gain some knowledge on, so that you can make a really informed choice about whether therapy might be the right steps for you. And that's not to say that we're creating this video because we think everybody should have therapy. Absolutely not. It can be a really effective tool, but it's also not always the most accessible thing. It can be really scary, and it might feel really overwhelming to think about talking to a complete stranger about some of those experiences. And I think it's still quite a stigmatized thing in our society as well. So this video isn't us preaching at you. It's not us saying you should have therapy. What it is part of our aim to empower you and to make sure that you have all of the information on various different aspects of your experience and your recovery, so that you can make really informed choices moving forward. So I guess really to start off, what is therapy? Therapy is essentially a tool. It's a tool that can help you to manage really specific life experiences. It can be a tool to help you manage and support yourself through transitions in your life. It can be there to help you to manage really specific fears or anxieties. But generally, the overall aim of therapy is to help you to better understand yourself, to understand what might be underpinning your emotions, your thoughts, your behaviours. And once you've got that awareness of yourself and that understanding and perhaps acceptance over some of your life experiences, the idea is to help to integrate, whether that be completely different or new or more informed ways of coping with difficult emotions. Therapy doesn't profess to get rid of difficult emotions. We all experience a wide range of emotions throughout our lives, and unfortunately we can't alleviate suffering, but what we can do is empower you and to give you the tools to help better manage that suffering, so that you're able to live a more fulfilled life and hopefully to engage in anything and everything that you want to engage in without the same level of barriers that you may have had before entering therapy. So there are lots of different types of therapies, and psychotherapy is kind of an umbrella term for talking therapy. And there are, potentially hundreds of different types of therapies, and each one will have its own theories on what makes us human. They will have their own approaches to different presentations, different views on what works best. But ultimately, most practitioners will be trained in multiple approaches. Not all, and we'll get to that later when it comes to kind of picking a therapist, but a lot of therapists are what we call integrative, and that's how I practice. So I've had training in lots of different approaches, and ultimately the interventions or the approach that I use with a client is very much dependent on their preferences, on their experiences, not just the things that they might be finding difficult, but considering things like how do you best learn? How do you best interact with things? You know, are you somebody that prefers structure? Do you like set exercises? Or are you somebody that, you know, prefers things to be a little bit more with the flow and you want to just talk about what comes up in the moment? Ultimately, although I'm the one trained, you know, in these approaches, I would never take an expert-based approach. Therapy is all about collaboration. So it's about working with your client to get to know what they need. And although we can share our thoughts on what might be best, ultimately it's around working together to find out what's going to work. And that's something that is an ongoing process throughout therapy as well. So, you know, we may pick to do one intervention, but actually find that it wasn't really that helpful. So we'll constantly review what's working for you and perhaps what isn't, so that you can be in control of the journey, I suppose. And that's something that most therapists will do, to allow you to be in the driving seat, really. And I guess one of the first ways in which we decide on an approach is to do an assessment, which is essentially just a conversation. It usually takes place over kind of 1 or 2 sessions, depending on the service. And basically it's information gathering. It's figuring out, you know, who you are as a person, as an individual, you know, what some of your background has looked like, what some of your life experiences have been like, and ultimately what's brought you to therapy and what you hope to gain from therapy. And then together, the therapist will usually share some of their own reflections and some of their own thoughts around what might be the best approach moving forward. And you'll agree on I don't like to say treatment plan because it sounds kind of medical, but ultimately that's kind of what you're determining is what are the next steps, what things do we want to work towards, and how are we going to do it. And it's also worth mentioning that depending on the service, particularly with NHS services, it might be that the service that you've been referred into might not be the most appropriate or the best appropriate to serve your specific needs. So they might find that they have to refer you to somebody else. And that can happen quite frequently. That doesn't mean that there is anything wrong with anything you've said. It doesn't mean that they don't want to work with you. What it means is that they want you to get the best out of the service, even if that means not working with themselves. So try not to read too much into that if that happens, because it just means that there's somebody else who is perhaps more specialist or perhaps more suited to working with what you're specifically finding difficult at the minute. So therapy can be offered in lots of different ways, and much like the approach or interventions used, it's really about what your preferences are. So some people, the idea of sitting on a couch opposite somebody is just, feels horrible. You know, even just the thought of perhaps going to somewhere unknown where, you know, you have to park your car or whatever the reason is, some people just really don't find that preferable. And actually, after COVID, pretty much every single service now operates online. So you can have, whether that's of a Zoom or, you know, Teams, you can have that video call session, or even over the telephone, because some people really struggle with eye contact. And it might be easier to open up and to not have somebody kind of watching you while you're talking. So whatever the way that suits you best, you know, make sure you advocate for that, because that's ultimately what your practitioner would want, is for you to feel as comfortable as you can in, let's face it, quite an uncomfortable situation, especially in those first few sessions. It takes some getting used to, you know, the therapeutic relationship and how it works. So always feel able to question the kind of way that the therapy is facilitated, and if it's not right for you, we can make adaptations. And therapy can also be offered in groups as well. You could have group-based therapy with people that may be experiencing something similar to yourself. And you can also have couples therapy, family therapy. essentially, whatever you are struggling with, if it makes sense to do that in a couple or in your family, then that's something that you can explore. But specifically for any trauma work, anything that, maybe means that you want to reflect on your experience, what's brought you to enough resources, then one-to-one therapy is definitely preferable. That doesn't mean that you couldn't have couples therapy before or afterwards, but if it's aspects specifically of your experience that you want to process or better understand, then one-to-one therapy is probably where you would want to start. So when might it be a good idea to explore therapy? I find this question quite hard actually, because I think it's really important that anybody can access therapy at any time in their life, and you don't have to be at rock bottom, you don't have to be really struggling. I think actually we should be promoting therapy as a tool to keep ourselves feeling healthy and having a really good level of self-awareness. So there is no specific right time for somebody to access therapy. I would say if it feels right for you, for whatever reason, then it's right for you. But there also might be times when therapy might be more beneficial, and it might be something that's worth experiencing. And I guess in relation to some of the other videos, if you've watched our trauma response videos or the videos around experiencing triggers, I'm hoping that you have some knowledge on that topic and you understand that these are a really normal part of the recovery process, and they're a really understandable response to really awful experiences. And although there is no end point, although there is no time scale on when you should stop experiencing these things, the level of impact that these are having is what's important when considering therapy. So if you're finding yourself constantly in that threat mode, constantly in that survival mode where you are responding to everything as if it were a trauma, whether that's being in your freeze zone really frequently, whether that's constantly being, maybe even in your fight zone where you feel like you need to fight everything all the time or run away from everything, or even if you're finding that you're experiencing triggers so frequently and so intensely that you really can't navigate your life how you would want to. If these things are really interfering with daily living, then it might be that although post-traumatic response is a perfectly normal thing, it might mean that these presentations, this phenomena is having more of an impact, and it might mean that you may want to seek help from somebody. And that could look like experiencing really regular and intensely overwhelming flashbacks. It could be having really regular intrusive thoughts, whether that be about the experience itself or, really critical thoughts towards yourself. It might even look like you constantly feeling on edge, constantly feeling like you need to be on the lookout for danger. And it might mean that you are avoiding things in your life that you didn't used to avoid. You're not able to socialize, you can't go out. Basically anything that you used to do that you enjoyed, you're finding you can't do anymore. And it may be changes in your mood as well. You may find it really difficult to kind of regulate your mood. You might feel really high one minute and then really low the next, or you might be really irritable. These are all signs of post-traumatic response, post-traumatic stress. And I don't use the term PTSD. I don't say post-traumatic stress disorder, because I don't view it as a disorder. And this is just my kind of clinical opinion, but I much prefer the term post-traumatic response, because you are responding to something. You're responding to something in a really normal way. That doesn't mean you have a disorder. That doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. But it also doesn't mean that you have to experience those things. And there are people and things that can help to help reduce the intensity and the unpleasantness of those symptoms. But ultimately, having therapy and knowing if it's the right choice is completely up to you. But if you are listening to this video and you are thinking, maybe it's something I would benefit from, then we just want you to feel empowered and have the information that you need to, even just start to look at what that option might even look like. So I've mentioned that there are probably quite an overwhelming number of types of therapy, but regardless of the approach, the overall aim of therapy is to provide a safe space. It's to provide a really unique space where your voice is heard, you're listened to, and you're listened to without judgment or advice giving. And, whether somebody uses one intervention or the other, the main aspect of therapy is developing a therapeutic relationship with the person that you're working with. And actually, there's a lot of research to show that the therapeutic relationship is the most effective tool in therapy. It's the one that evidences the most change in people. And ultimately, that relationship is then something that you're able to experience with others. Once you've experienced a really safe and caring relationship, then you're able to experience that with other people around you as well. And that's one of the most powerful things in therapy, and it's certainly the tool that I rely on the most. I could learn every fancy intervention in the book, but ultimately, unless I can create a safe space for my clients, then we're not going to work. We're not going to see that change. So that's definitely something to expect. And that's why it's so important that the therapist feels right for you. And not every therapist will be the right fit for everybody. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But as I've said, it would be a very long video if I was to go through every single type of therapy offered. And there's a link below this website to something called the Counselling Directory, which has a really helpful page on all of the different types of therapy and what they're about, what they might be used for, and how to access them. So we've put the link to that below this video on the website. But I did think I would talk you through just a couple of approaches on particularly types of therapy that's really helpful for trauma. So the first one is called trauma-focused CBT. And CBT basically stands for cognitive behavioural therapy. And generic CBT is all around understanding how our thoughts impact our feelings and our behaviour. It is quite a structured therapy, so it's very much around skills-based development. There's a lot of structured activities and interventions. You may be even asked to do kind of work in between your sessions, keep thought diaries, trackers of beliefs that you have, of things that you've experienced. And it will remain, I suppose, very much focused on the present and how you are currently managing things to help you to develop certain coping skills. Now, trauma-focused CBT, it expands on that, and it's a very specific type of therapy that helps you to better understand what trauma is, how people respond to trauma, and particularly, I guess, very similar to some of our videos around normalizing trauma response, understanding how your brain and your body reacts. And the idea is to de-shame and to normalize how you're feeling. Now, the next phase of CBT it's called gradual exposure. And essentially what your therapist will work with you is to slowly introduce aspects of your memories, aspects of your experience, and they will ask you to recall those memories in the session. And the aim of this is to hopefully reduce any power that those memories hold over you, to reduce the intensity of those memories. But it's also really important to highlight that this won't be forced upon you. It's very gradual, and before you even start to think about talking about your experience, you will work with your therapist to create almost like a safety toolbox. So ways of helping to ground yourself in session. So the idea of bringing yourself back to the present moment. You will work to create kind of like a safe space. So somewhere that you can take your mind, even activities or things that you enjoy that you can do after the session. And ultimately you have complete control over when and how much of your experience that you recall. And as you go through this process of recalling these memories, the therapist will help you to identify what they refer to as hotspots. So whether that be specific parts of the experience that really stand out, or whether it be parts of the experience that really have intense thoughts and feelings attached to them. And what you will do is you will move through those experiences. You'll navigate those thoughts, and ultimately it aims to kind of restructure any thoughts that you have towards any aspect of the experience, to help you to, I suppose, if an example is that there's a lot of critical thoughts towards yourself being identified, then the aim would be to help to reduce the level of blame and to increase the kind of compassionate style thinking of those thoughts, and ultimately help you to navigate them and manage any unwanted feelings better as well. So another type of processing therapy is called EMDR, which is a bit of a mouthful, which is why we have the acronym, but it stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. We'll stick with EMDR. And much like trauma-focused CBT, the aim of EMDR is to reduce the intrusiveness of the memories and to help you to, I suppose, to process the memory in a way that has less control over you, less power, and you can live your life in the way that you want to. And I guess, again, like we've spoken about in some of the other videos, the way that we process trauma memories, it means that they're not always processed in the same way as our everyday experiences. And what EMDR does is it helps us to I suppose, refile aspects of the memory, not just the actual past memory, but how we're experiencing it in the present, and also how we might experience the memory in the future as well. And unlike trauma-focused CBT, with EMDR, you don't necessarily have to go through the memory from start to finish. You don't have to think about it in the same level of depth as you do with trauma-focused CBT, which is sometimes why people find this approach more preferable, because it can be less invasive. And one of the unique things with EMDR is that as you're talking through your memory, or as you're thinking through your memory, you're also doing something called bilateral stimulation, which basically means you are doing something that is in a rhythmic left to right movement. So a lot of EMDR therapists, they will use their fingers and they will ask you to follow them like this. You may even sort of do tapping, which we have a full video on in our support resources. And this is something that can really help regulate your nervous system. And the science behind the EMDR is still emerging. But ultimately, the idea is that this bilateral stimulation, it helps to, I suppose it helps us to store the memory differently. It helps us to process in a way that feels less invasive than other approaches. That's not to say it's not intense, it is. But like every other type of therapy, you will have sufficient grounding work so that you have safety resources in place. And it's also worth mentioning something called somatic therapy, because we've talked about the fact that trauma isn't just psychological, it's physiological as well, and it can really impact our body because we store it in our body. So somatic therapy is all around body-based working, and it can be integrated into talking therapy. But it's essentially, it's reintroducing bodily awareness, and it's re-scripting your body to tell it that it's safe. And that's through a range of different exercises, whether that be yoga or breathing exercises, the tapping, like I've just shown you. And it can be a really, really great way to help regulate your nervous system. So that's also something to consider if you are somebody that feels a lot of symptoms in your body. But whatever the type of therapy, it's really important that you know that it's got to be at the right pace for you. And ultimately, if it doesn't feel right, then you're allowed to tell us. You're allowed to say if we're moving too fast. You're allowed to say if we're not moving fast enough. Ultimately, your therapist will want to do what's right for you. And having a good awareness of the different things that you could try is a really good way to advocate for yourself as well. So there are lots of ways to access therapy, but I really do acknowledge that how you access therapy and how easy it is to access therapy might very much depend on your financial situation. You can access private therapy, and it is expensive. It's an investment, and not everybody can afford to do it. But it is worth noting that most therapists will offer a sort of sliding scale. So they will do student discounts, they will do lower rates for low income individuals. And that's always something that you can ask about. And we've put a link to the counselling directory on the website, and that's a really great way to find a therapist because they will bring up all of the therapists in your local area, and each of them have a profile talking all about how they approach therapy, their training, whether they practice online, face-to-face, and they also tell you how much it is as well. And most of them will offer a free consultation, which basically means that you can speak to them for about 10 to 15 minutes, ask any questions you might have, and generally get a feel for whether they feel like the right fit for you. If you're not in a position to pay for private therapy, there are a few steps that you can take to access funded services. Now, one of those is to speak to your GP, is to make an appointment and briefly talk to them about what you're struggling with, and they can refer you to one of the local talking therapy services. They may also talk to you about a referral to the mental health team, depending on your level of need. And the mental health team, they may be able to offer more input than a talking therapy service, but that's something that they will assess, and ultimately, again, that's something that's your choice. But I also recognise that for some, it might be very difficult to get a GP appointment, and for others, they may just really not want to talk to a GP about it. So there are a lot of services where you can self-refer online. So you can fill out a brief form and essentially add yourself onto the waiting list. We have a page on our website that's dedicated to the steps that you would need to take, and on that page, but we've also put it on this under this video, is a link to finding free services in your area. So it's on the NHS website, and you basically put your postcode in and kind of what you're looking for, and it will bring up all of the services that are free. And most of those services do accept online referrals as well, because sometimes it can be easier to write these things down rather than having to speak to so many different people before you've even started. So if you've watched this video, I really hope that you know a little bit more about therapy and what to expect and how to find it. And if it is something that you were thinking about before, or maybe you started to think about during, I really hope that you feel you have more tools to be able to go out and find something that's right for you. And it can be a really good tool to help you navigate things. And it's a really brave step, but it's not a step that you have to take. It's not the step that's right for everybody. And ultimately, it's got to be your choice. And therapy it's a two-way relationship, and unless you're really wanting to explore it, then it probably won't be helpful. So really the take-home message is, it is out there, it is accessible, but only if it's the right step for you to take, and there should be no pressure for you to take it. And ultimately, like every other aspect of your recovery, you know yourself and you know what works for you and what doesn't work for you. But if you have any questions about any aspect of the video, or you've read something about another type of therapy and you're wondering, you know, I want to know more about that, we could create specific videos on different types of therapy. Or you know, you maybe even want to share your experience of therapy yourself with other people, whether that be, you know, things that were helpful, and you'd like us to create a video on some of those tools. Whatever it is, as always, it would be really great to hear from you.